This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Much. As they say in all the best programs, is this on? I think it is actually. Yeah. Thanks very much for your attendance. Those of you who are here in person, coming up to a bank holiday weekend. I think upwards of 60 or so that are joining us online. You're very welcome also. I especially like to welcome our panelists this afternoon. Thank them for making the time to be here, as I say, on a weekend, on a holiday, coming up to a holiday weekend, particularly appreciative of your time. Today's event is part of our Pathways series, Pathways Ireland's Agriculture Future project, examining how this country's agri-food sector can meet climate targets while supporting rural communities and economic growth. Today's paper and subsequent discussion entitled Farm to Finance, the Processor-Farmer Nexus in Ireland's Agricultural Climate Transition. It's up there on the screen. Farm to Finance, the Processor-Farmer Nexus in Ireland's Agricultural Climate Transition. It's a paper by our colleague, Dr. Matt O'Neill, who's joining us on the panel this afternoon, as you will hear shortly. And that paper looks at the relationship between food processors and farmers as Ireland seeks to align its agri-food system with climate goals. At the Institute, the IIEA, we're here to foster open, evidence-based dialogue, and your insights are absolutely critical to making this conversation meaningful and productive. So your input is not only valued by us, but regarded as indispensable by us at events like this, and indeed in the other contexts that we have with you. We're not expecting any fire drills in the building today, but if you do hear an alarm, please exit calmly and gather across the street. If you need assistance, let us know, and our staff are here to help. The format is going to include a presentation followed by an open Q&A. When asking a question, just raise your hand and the chair will invite you. State your name and affiliation is our convention here at the Institute, and then ask the question. And then if online you wish to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function there. So we look forward to a constructive discussion. Good to hand over to the chair for this session, Professor Alan Matthews, and take this opportunity again to thank Alan for all of his assistance, his guidance, and indeed his leadership, if I may say so, of this important initiative at the IIEA. So Alan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and good afternoon to everybody in the room and to all of you online. I'm going to chair the discussion for the session today. We will begin with a short overview of this paper, which deals with the processor-farmer nexus in Ireland's agricultural climate transition, which will be given by Dr. Matt O'Neill, the climate project lead here in the Institute. And then we have a panel of four people who will comment on different aspects from their own backgrounds, and I will introduce those as the opportunity arises. So first, Matt, I'm going to ask you to take the floor.
Sorry, I'm juggling two items here and trying to read off my knee. First of all, I just want to say thank you all for coming, and I'd also just want to say thank you to all the interview participants for this project. It can be quite hard to put yourself forward and have someone ask a lot of questions for an hour and have open dialogue, and it's very important to get a sense or a snapshot of what's happening in that. So, as we've noticed, this research examines the farmer-processor relationship and how the costs and responsibilities of sustainability are distributed within the food supply chain itself, and it's focused on that relationship and tries to carve out some sort of potential point for implementing climate aligned farming practices and as part of the overall targeting system for the climate. So let's begin. Ireland's agri-food sector contributes 37.8% of the country's total emissions, significantly higher than many other economic sectors. And, this creates an urgent need for change. Now, but what does that change look like? That's the sort of questions I was asking. The sector faces what we might call a dual challenge, meeting increasingly stringent climate targets while maintaining economic competitiveness in global markets. This is a balancing act, and it's at the heart of Ireland's agricultural transition, I would make the case. What makes this particularly complex is that distribution of responsibility across the supply chain Farmers are expected to deliver most of the sector's emission reductions at times, yet our research shows that they often lack elements such as like adequate financial support, maybe don't get the access to technical tools that they may need, and they also need support for meaningful market incentives to make these challenges economically viable as an industry for them. Meanwhile, processors face mounting downstream pressures from retailers, consumers, and indeed investors, and demonstrates sustainable sourcing practices. However, they're limited in their ability to drive farm-level change without coherent support frameworks that align with environmental and economic priorities. That's just a fancy way to say things are a bit disconnected in what I'm trying to unpack here. So one thing I looked at was like, I wanted to start thinking about this as more of a multi-layered network. And if I go to my lovely diagram next, there's three key primary components. From all the interviewers and the stakeholder forum we used to do this interview, I based this map on this and how they viewed the actual food chain itself. So we had primary production systems, dairy, beef, mixed and organic, intermediary actors, process distributors and retailers, and government frameworks, EU and national policies. And they're all interdependent relationships shaped by the market, institution, and social factors around this. So this is just sort of the rough diagram. I would put a caveat here to say this is not a finished diagram, in that I think it can be built on and add more into different sectors or different ideas that I could have maybe missed in the research. It's more a conversation to start going and around how are all these different things impacting farmers and processors. So if we move in next, so in my mind is an evolving relationship, again, multi-dimensional systems beyond physical product movement. I think that was a very key thing that people wanted to know, that there was an awful lot of knowledge transfer partnerships happening in communities and different farmers from the interviews that I was talking with. There's increased importance on the information exchange, as I just noted, and there's also new and old dimensions blending, technical specifications, contractual obligations, and incentive structures. And what I found was it's not that the farmers and processors are not aware of them. It's just it may not be they understand how to access them. They may need extra training. They may different support. It's just that there was a multitude of different needs that were not being met. And the question is, how do you sort of circle that hole is one thing I was trying to figure out. So, and then the other thing that came around the corner from the interviews after engagement was sort of the emerging focus on carbon and nature markets. And then the other point was data and verification channels. This was a very big topic that came up from all different sides of the relationship. So when I spoke to within the financial sphere, they wanted more data to make better judgments on how they can give economic loans to different farmers that maybe wanted to change their farming practices. When I spoke to processors, they were very keen to build their own sort of market incentive mechanisms, specifically in dairy, to support to support their farmers, but not all cooperatives are built equally. And then the third would be farmers want to know what happens to the data. They go out and they will collect a lot of data. They'll go out and collect a lot of points, but they're like, what specifically is it used for? How can they use it to help build their own business case? And how does that translate to building their own business case? That doesn't mean that when discussing with them, they want to carry on with the normal practice of maybe dairy, beef, etc. They maybe would want to try something else or try something riskier in terms of climate, but they wanted to know how they could use that data to make that business case to give that a go and try it within the climate transition. So it was more of a complex array of these different issues that sort of muddled. Then there's the sort of the key policy context and shaping the transition we looked at in the paper. We looked at the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and the unfair trading practices. And then talking about like how we unpack like the Irish implementation through a phased approach and how that operates. What I would say is like the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, will require companies to identify and address environmental impacts throughout their value chains. This extends responsibility beyond the directive operations, including supplier practices. And again, it can help strengthen that relationship. Oh, so this is the homing in. We tried to like delve into what are those different market factors that was discussed. So we have at center of the farmer-processor relationship, The blue are sort of the outside pressures that will pull levers on that relationship and how they're going. If you go for like finance sector versus sustainability and targets regulations, and advisory services play a huge role in how to manage both, in how they engage with each other. The red is sort of the outside market shocks that impact those different outside levers and impact the relationship in itself indirectly. So I was just, again, it's not, this is complete. This is the snapshot I got of who I spoke to. And one thing I hope to do in the future is speak to different members within this food value chain to build on this research and give a sense more to these different diagrams. They're very much open for people to take and add, critique, or build upon in that, because we were trying to do a very much open and transparent research. And I'll get to that in a moment with some of the data we collected. So we also looked at the science-based targets, as you know, in terms of driving corporate commitments. And we looked at there's 131 companies in Ireland across all sectors that are part of that. And within the agricultural food sector, it was 27. So and then we looked at company sizes, influence, and the adoption capacity, and then and then I'll unpack the different key stakeholder themes. So with this, in terms of the SBI, I was telling 27 have signed up with a validation climate target of 19, and only 3 have had commitments removed, which isn't bad compared to other sectors or other EU member states. The other thing we looked at would be the dairy sector through line commitments through throughput. So one thing we've done is all the data sets we use for this are public. So anybody is able to go on and take them and add to them if they wish, come back and offer any different analysis if they want, and try and make it more of a collaborative approach. Now, these are not reflective of the entire industry. I should make this clear. It's very much that we, me and Grace, we went through and went through all the major dairy and meat companies, and went through their sustainability reporting and collected the data where they were in scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 commitments. And then we also collected where they were in terms of like throughput, and tried to connect that commitment rate through the level of throughput. So with dairy, we were only able to get 6 companies and 5 with commitment rates. So that came to roughly around about 89.4%, but that's not reflective of the whole industry. And then with meat, we just looked specifically at beef only. We were able to get 3 companies all with commitment rates, and that offered a 52.4%. I should say that did not include pork or lamb, and that's not reflective of the whole. This was just to give a snapshot of the data, and also sort of reflects the point around the need for more public information around all 3 different spheres, the financial, processor, and farmers, to be able to engage in that debate. That was sort of the purpose of this exercise. And then the third data set was we looked at scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. So again, we were able to collect information on 36 dairy processors, and we're able to collect information on 50 meat processors. And that sort of just gives you a breakdown. The one interesting thing to note here is that scope 3 remains a huge challenge. Let me go to my notes here. And scope 3 remains a huge challenge, and that's because it really is looking more at the agricultural sector and around the different areas in that. So one theme was building trust and leveraging technology. One thing I found that in all the interviews and in the input from the stakeholder forum is that trust is fundamental to the processor-farmer collaboration. Data privacy concerns and emission reporting was reported by some farmers on the ground. And then technological adoption requires equitable access and support. I know people would maybe challenge me on that. I'm just offering again a snapshot of what people were thought in terms of the struggles they were having and trying to access this for themselves. And then effective incentive models which can balance economic and environmental outcomes. That's the one thing I find interesting, in that everybody was very much switched on to the issues. They all had really engaged ideas on how to inform them. They were willing to give feedback. And then the last one was sort of the role of public-private financing and de-risking transition investments. There was a sense that there needed to be a rebalancing of the food chain I showed you at the beginning, in that structure. So what does this all mean in terms of thoughts for discussion and dialogue? So some of the ideas we put out there are based on the interviews and some general reading around other best practices. They're all very much cited in the paper. One was strengthening monitoring and reporting and verification platforms such as AgNav, which we have here in Ireland. There's a redevelopment coming. Then designing hybrid financing models to de-risk on-farm climate investments. One idea I put forward in the paper is talking about food as a public good in terms of shaping that sort of private that private public investment. And that doesn't mean we stay business as practice. That's sort of open to how we think about that in terms of in terms of linking it to climate resilience in the future. And then the next was promoting fair distribution of sustainability costs across the food chain and not placing all the pressure on the farmers alone. And then broaden incentive access and integrate technology equitability, and then institutionalize stakeholder dialogue. One thing I thought was very important and a lot of people really were happy with was somebody was coming and speaking to them and getting their input directly. And it wasn't just the data being collected. They wanted to have their voice heard as well. So I think something in creating maybe a policy kitchen where we could go out and get rural communities as well and how they're impacted to be able to voice these opinions would be very useful, and have them ongoing to be able to feed into this sort of live policy issue as it moves forward. So obviously my conclusions were in the report was climate transition requires balanced approach to the environmental and economic priorities. Success depends on trust and equitable cost distribution. Food production is a public good requiring both public and private investment, and collaborative support across the supply chain is very much essential. So that's my presentation. So we'll go to the panelists.
Thanks a lot, Matt. That was a very good introduction, I think, to the key points in the paper. We now have 4 speakers who will react from their individual backgrounds, and I'm going to move from left to right. So Tig Buckley is currently Director of Policy and Chief Economist with the Irish Farmers Association. Prior to joining the IFA, Tig was in the finance industry as head of agriculture with AIB Bank. He was also a Nuffield Scholar in 2009, where he examined the role of the dairy futures markets and other price risk mechanisms in the EU dairy industry. And he continues, I understand, to be actively involved in dairy farming on his home farm in North Cork. So Tig, maybe a few minutes just to react to what you've heard from Matt in terms of this processor-farmer relationship in incentivizing climate change.
Thanks, Alan. And first of all, I think a lot of credit should go to Matt and the Institute for taking the time to go and look at this area. And I think it's interesting, Matt, that you said that people were glad to be contacted about it or to be brought into the conversation. There's probably a message in that as much as anything else. I think it's the relationship with farmers and processors is quite, it's incredibly integrated, whether it be in dairy, which is predominantly farmer owned, or it's in meat, which is predominantly private owned, but they're still heavily integrated. And I suppose something that maybe we often kind of don't realize is that the vast majority of farmers in Ireland don't actually interact with consumers in terms of, they don't sell their produce direct to consumers, really. So their interaction in terms of their interaction with the marketplace is with their processor. So the processor then has a huge, plays a huge role in terms of their, actions of farmers as part of, overall framework, be it from regulatory or whether they're incentivized. Because a lot of the time, the regulatory side of it is often, it ends up with the processor to monitor a good chunk of that regulatory side of it. And so in terms of incentivizing farmers then to as part of the sustainability challenge, there's going to be, that relationship is absolutely integral. It's the most important relationship of all, actually, is the processor-farmer relationship. Because again, it's where the farmers are interacting with the marketplace, really. So I think some of the things that a lot of what Matt said, I think he's very balanced in how he's gone about it. A few things, I suppose. I think we have made a lot of progress. I know, like, people will say we're not going fast enough. A lot of what you need to do in the initial phases, you need to set up the structures to be able to do it. So, like, one of the things now, if you look at data collection, we actually are very advanced. Ireland is one of the most advanced countries in terms of data collection, and there's now another initiative called AgNav, which Matt referred to, which is kind of taking that to another level again. And we are one of the most, there's very few countries in the world that are as advanced in terms of having a framework to collect that data, which is very challenging at a farm level. Now, getting it verified is, would be the next step. But we are a long ways down the line on that, and that's very useful. So another thing that that we have a lot of advantage on is that we, from a breeding perspective, the farmers actually we own our own breeding federation. So we have the ICBF, which I said on the Irish Cattle Breeders Federation. So unlike nearly almost every other country, it's not in private hands. It's in farmership. It's owned by the sector. And again, one of the things that has been happening there in the last 2 years is, in collaboration with the processors, is the National Genotyping Program. So again, what that is doing is effectively we are genotyping a huge amount of our livestock in Ireland. Like, there's no other country in the world as a percentage is doing as many. And the benefits from that from a sustainability perspective probably won't be seen till the latter half of this decade because it's a slow burn. But what that will do as one of the things it does is it will allow us, first of all, to basically look at, you're looking at the genotype of these animals and you're figuring out which ones have the best sustainability credentials. In other words, produce the least amount of methane. And then you can pick them and you can breed off them. So again, that takes a bit of time, but that's something that that's there at the moment. And it's just started, and we'll see probably first tranche of animals that have gone through it are a year old now. So I think the other thing to say is that what would concern me a bit is that the whole sustainability side of it, and people have heard me saying this before, is a lot of the research that is being done on this now. I saw there was a paper last week, UCC released a paper last week, Tia Hennessy was involved, and the point about when consumers are paying, it's the value proposition that they're paying for rather than the sustainability proposition. And this is one of a number of pieces of research that are saying this. Now, that's a concern because if that's where the consumers are approaching it, and look, in fairness, that may be down to the way that they're being programmed, or certainly, or that the marketing maybe is part of it. I'm not sure, but if we have to make sure that we have that the food value chain works in some sort of way that prices in sustainability in an appropriate manner, that it just doesn't all end up at the bottom of the food value chain, and that would worry me a lot about how we do that. I mean, Matt mentioned unfair trading practices and other regulations like that, which I think is absolutely integral to trying to look at this whole challenge. Because if we don't have regulation around that, I don't think we're going to get a situation where we're going to see, I think what you said, the balance of economic and environmental outcomes, which you said in your thing, which is absolutely critical to it.
I think we're going to come back to this key point about the distribution of the costs, if you like, of sustainability along the value chain in this discussion. But let me come next to Dale. Dale Crammond is the Director of Meat Industry Ireland, but before that he had been working with the Department of Agriculture and Food and the Marine, both at the Embassy of Ireland in Washington, but also on the issue of agricultural greenhouse gases back here in Dublin. So Dale, from your point of view, to me, the meat industry has a slightly different relationship with its suppliers than, say, the dairy industry. And I don't know whether that's something that you'd like to comment on. How does that affect your ability to incentivize your suppliers to take climate action?
Yeah, look, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you, Matt. A good paper. It's one of the issues we have to grapple with, Alan. As you say, On the dairy side, the relationships tend to be more defined in terms of how farmers supply into a milk processor. They tend to be over a period, contracts over a period of years, the supply agreements. On the beef side, it's a little bit more challenging because it's more competitive probably, you know, in the marketplace, particularly at the moment, you could say. Farmers we don't have the same relationship with our farmers. Notwithstanding that, we have to do everything we can, you know, from a processor perspective to try and, you know, advance the sustainability agenda. And that's something, you know, very important to us. Last year, we launched our Charter for Sustainable Irish Beef. So that brings the meat processing members of Meat Industry Ireland. We probably represent about 90% of throughput on the beef and lamb side. You know, to sign up to measurable targets that we will be assessed on an annual basis. So I suppose if you look at it over the last 10 years, it's probably fair to say if you take the whole suite and range of kind of sustainability initiatives, you know, members would have, you know, committed something like 200 million, you know, to this area. I think Ty stole one of my lines on the genotyping program, and it was the one point maybe, Matt, that you did miss out on. It's a very substantial investment, you know, from the meat and the dairy industry. It'll be something like, you know, 17, 18 million by the time the program concludes. So that is a significant investment. I suppose one of the points, and we touched on it earlier, it's almost, you've set it out as the farmer processor nexus. It's almost like you need the third, you know, stage in that as well in terms of the consumer, because the consumer at the end of the day has a very, very significant influence on the relationship, you know, between the processor and back to the farmer again. And I suppose what I mean by that is, you know, in terms of, you know, the price they are prepared to pay, you know, for sustainably produced products. And my concern would be that there's a limit to that, Alan, you know, what they are prepared to pay. And, you know, we've seen a very significant increase in the price of beef, which will be welcomed by Ty's members, but that has created a challenge for the processing sector in terms of being able to, you know, get those returns back in the marketplace. And that kind of recalibration is happening at the moment, and we have to see how that plays out. Consumers often say they're willing, and any consumer study or any vox pop that you will do in this area, nearly every consumer surveyed, they'll all say that yes, they will pay more for sustainably produced produce. But then when it comes to it, when they act in the supermarket, it's often very different, and price will be the king. So that is a real conundrum here, you know, as we try to kind of, you know, establish, you know, what is a fair system. At the end of the day, as a processor and as someone that represents the processors, our objective is to sell the different parts of the animal to the markets that will return the best price back to the farmer. And we need to make, you know, a profit margin along the way to do that, you know, and that's what it's about. And if we have to pay a little bit more to the farmer and we can maintain that, you know, margin within the sector, well that's fine, and that's very positive. So leave it at that.
Thanks, David. Again, I bringing up this distributional aspect, we'll certainly come back to it. Before I introduce Francis, if there's anybody online that wants to ask a question of either Matt or comment on any of the things that the panelists are mentioning, please feel free to put that into your Q&A, and we'll come to it. Francis McDonnell is our third panelist and brings a particularly interesting perspective, I think, to this discussion. She's an award-winning journalist and producer, and currently deputy news editor with Agriland, a former business editor and correspondent with the Sunday Times Ireland and the Irish Times. Previously worked with Sky News and BBC Northern Ireland. Grew up on her family's farm in County Tyrone, and in her role with Agriland, she regularly reports on key issues affecting farm families and rural communities. So, Francis, you have this wonderful perspective looking in. How do you see this relationship between processors and their suppliers, farmers on the ground. It can be quite conflictual at times, I guess.
But I'm not surprised that Matt found that farmers wanted to talk about it, because we talk to farmers every day. And one of the key issues that they tell us is that they feel they're not being listened to. They're not being listened to by companies, by processors, by government, because they're under extreme pressure, from cost pressure to environmental issues. And at the end of the day, they feel that they're at the bottom of the blame chain, more so than being integrated into the food chain. Because every time there's a story about emissions, there's always a line about agriculture, but there's very rarely a line about how farmers are working really hard to improve sustainability. There is huge cost pressures on achieving that. And any farmer that we talk to will never want to leave their farm in a worse place. Their whole ethos is about handing on the family farm to the next generation. And that's another issue that Matt brought up, is where is the next generation of farmers? Where are they coming from? And do they see a future in farming? And that's one of the issues when you talk about sustainability, it's the crucial issue that we have to address in this country now.
Great. We'll come back to that, and but listen, we'll first listen to our final panelist, Ailbe Gerard, who is representing the farmer interest on the panel. She is the founder of Brookfield Farm, a farmer, a beekeeper, but also a researcher, agricultural educator, with a deep interest in agriculture, creativity, and regeneration. Ailbe has studied sustainable development and organic farming in the UK, and then has returned home to Ireland, where she's been, in a sense, implementing in practice the skills and ideas that she has learned on Brookfield. So, Ailbe, you're at one end of this so-called nexus. How does it look from your point of view?
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much, Matt, for inviting me into the IIEA. It's a really important discussion. I'm very happy to be part of it. I'm here representing Talamh Beo, which is an organisation for regenerative agriculture in Ireland. So I'm not just here on my own behalf, even though I'm very happy to speak as a farmer. I'm here to represent the interests of farmers. There's a growing number of us who are really interested in changing the way this model is working, because it's not working particularly well for farmers. I think Irish agriculture has done an extraordinarily good job in dairying and in meat processing and in exporting. And it has been very hard on farmers recently to meet the regulatory and legislative pressures that have been put upon them, both by processors and by government and in administering the legislation coming from Europe. Farmers, as Francis has pointed out very clearly, are doing their best, really want to work to make their land better. But we do have to stop exporting our meat and our milk, well, particularly meat, because this is today's context, at the expense of our water quality, at the expense of nitrous oxide going into the air, at the expense of the climate impact we're having. And as a farmer, I know that it's becoming harder to produce food, that we are definitely having an impacted climate, and things are becoming more difficult. At the same time, the input costs generally for conventional farmers are rising. And the conventional system, as has been pointed out, is that the product from most farms goes straight into a central processing system, that they're price takers and they have no control over what happens. I think the support is really important to start looking at that relationship between meat processors and farmers. I'm a meat farmer myself. I produce lamb. I've never once in my 15 years farming sent an animal to the factory. Sorry. I've sold each one of them directly to end consumers. And just to say a point on that, I don't think that's the solution for all Irish farmers, but it can make a huge contribution. I've talked to a lot, as part of my research, a lot of farmers, and they point out that direct sales can help that percentage. There's the percentage between profit and loss. If 10% of your sheep flock goes to some sort of direct sale or some sort of sale where you're getting more money, then then the rest of your flock is protected from the vagaries of what's happening in the meat industry. I think just to say on the report by Matt, a lot of very good work. I would very much like to see the retailers, not just the consumers. So it's a very good point to bring in the consumers. We need to see the retailers because we all know that's where the profit is going. And the pressures in price on farmers and on their incomes, and we know that meat farmers particularly are really impacted with income. And you can't, if you don't have income, there's no point having financial incentives and hybrid finance models to invest on your farm if you literally are living on €12,000 a year. You just don't have the room to do that. What we need to do is do a Horace Plunkett on it, change this system that is actually, frankly, not working for farmers. And it actually doesn't seem to be working for meat processors either. You're under huge pressure as well. Redistribute the profits that are in food. We know there's huge profits in food. And I'd love to see the retailers being part of this conversation. I'd love to have retailers here who are part of remaking the system. So the profits need to be redistributed to farmers and to consumers and away from, I'm afraid ABP meats, for instance, the huge profits are made in the meat industry, and that's not been seen by the farmers. And we can definitely remake a system. I mean, the dairy processing industry, when the co-ops were set up, it did very well for farmers. And it's partly because the dairy processors, the farmers owned the processing, and so they controlled a lot of the profits that went back to the farmers. That never happened in the meat industry. They tried to set up co-ops in the meat industry. Didn't quite work. So now we have this, frankly, very unbalanced power system. So as a farmer, you can't withhold your meat from meat factories because the people who own the factories can feed in animals from their own farms, for instance, which is not allowed to happen in most of Europe. That there's rules against that kind of control of the value chain, top to bottom. So those are the things I'd really like to look at, because what I have a vision for Irish agriculture. We have the most extraordinary place for growing food. We have extremely skilled farmers. We have really committed people in the agri-food system. Why aren't we working together to make it more equitable, better for our climate, better for the soil? Why are we exporting meat and milk to the detriment of all the things that make us able to produce food?
Okay, that's a very wide agenda, Ilva. Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.